Hello and welcome everyone to Season 4, Episode 15 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Christina Hagen, coming to you live from Cape Town. We have over 135 episodes recorded and available on YouTube. So if you miss out because of load shedding or your Tuesday nights have become busy, never fear, you can always catch up later. Tonight, we have one of my conservation inspirations on the show. Dr. Mark Brown will be sharing his insights into bird ringing and why we should continue doing it. Mark Brown is an ornithologist who loves sharing the world of birds with others. He's published many research papers and co-supervised a bunch of postgraduate students. Having worked in both academic world and NPO environment, he now runs a conservation travel business with a partner, providing hands-on learning experiences in the field of conservation for international students. His particular fields of interest are nectar-feeding birds, birds of prey, beach breeding birds, marine birds, and sea turtles. But frankly, he'll be interested in studying anything. As a passionate citizen scientist, Mark is a bird ringer, but also contributes to Sabbath 2, Quack, Safari, Elmo, and iNaturalist whenever he can. And Mark has been a great inspiration to me, as I said, in my career, and has provided great support to me over the years that I've known him. So, Mark, I'm very pleased to have you on the show, and I would like to invite you to start sharing and to take it away with your presentation.
Lovely. Thank you, Christina, and thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Very excited to be asked to host or to chat at one of these sessions. So thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen quickly. So let me just get that right. And then I am going to say that I've just scrolled down the names of everyone on, and there's a lot of names there that I recognize, and a lot of friends, a lot of colleagues, and some are quite daunting. So we'll try to get through this without messing up why bird ringing is important, considering some of the names on that list. So this is a question I get asked sometimes as an ornithologist and as someone who's passionate about bird ringing, is why ring birds? And so I developed this talk a while ago, and I did give it at Flock earlier this year in the wilderness, and was then asked to present it tonight to everyone. So we're going to jump right into it. So firstly, obviously we've got some ringers in the audience, which is really fantastic, but not everyone perhaps knows exactly what bird ringing is all about. And essentially, bird ringing involves placing uniquely numbered metal rings on a bird's leg. And that data then gets put on a database that is accessible internationally. And it enables people to track a date, a place, and maybe some biometric data or some sort of information about the bird that then gets on that database and can be looked up if the bird is ever recaught or found dead or reported to a ringing authority somewhere around the world. Looking at the history of bird ringing, one of the earliest sort of thoughts of birds moving around in that was in 1250 AD, when a prior in an abbey in Germany actually wrote a little note on a swallow's leg, and he wrote quite poetically, "Oh swallow, where do you live in winter?" And the message came back in the spring with the swallow in Asia, in the home of Petrus. And it was really the first sort of thought that maybe swallows actually move around and go from one place to another. Obviously, people were aware that swallows weren't in Europe all year round, but there wasn't really much idea where they went or what they did. And we'll talk about that a little bit just now. But just carrying on with the history of ringing, it was really a chap in Denmark, Hans Christian Cornelius Mortensen, that really wanted to find out where his birds were into. And he first started ringing common starlings in 1890 in Denmark, and got some returns in the early years. And Africa actually played quite a major role in the first few years, because there was a white stork that was ringed in Romania that was shot by a German farmer in Heimville in KwaZulu-Natal in 1909. And that bird had a ring on. And that was quite interesting, because there was evidence that storks had come to Africa, because one or two storks, guys, or spears stuck inside of them. It's actually a famous specimen, if I recall, in the Oslo Museum with its assegai. And so there was this thought that maybe the odd bird came down to Africa, but really when this bird was found in South Africa, right down at the bottom end of the continent, it blew people's minds. It sort of opened up this field of trans-equatorial migration and an understanding of birds' migration patterns. And it was one of the main reasons why bird ringing started in those early years. Now, before we really understood a little bit about migration and that, scientists had tried to come up with theories of what happened in Europe to birds in winter. And just using barn swallows as an example, in the 1500s to 1700s, barn swallows were thought to hibernate by burying themselves in lake mud. Even Aristotle thought this, and in 1878, Dr. Cruz listed 182 peer-reviewed scientific published papers that spoke about the hibernating patterns of swallows digging into the mud of lakes and ponds, and representations of fishermen pulling in nets of fish with swallows dotted in between the fish. And so the take-home message for me from that is, don't please believe everything that scientists tell you, because all we can do as biologists and as scientists is present the best plausible explanation that data gives us at this point in time. And so back then, the reputable scientists of the day thought that was the best explanation of why you only saw swallows in summer. Now we know differently, and it's mostly thanks to bird ringing and other projects, citizen science projects like bird atlasing. So a history of ringing in South Africa. Ringing started in South Africa in 1948, and it was a really dynamic team that decided to ring Cape vultures on the nests as chicks, 1,000 birds per year, and is normally fluctuating between sort of 180 and 200 odd active ringers in Southern Africa at any one time. Which is not a large, and in the States and in Canada, there's a lot more bird ringers operating, and across Europe as well per country. And in some countries, you actually got to really work hard to become a ringer. In South Africa, we have active training programs. We try to encourage as many people to get involved as bird ringing as possible, because the more people that are ringing birds, the higher the chance we have of getting data back from those birds that we ring. The photos on the slides are just to whet your appetite for the type of experiences you can have as a bird ringer as well, or if you accompany a bird ringing team on a field outing. So on the left-hand side, on the bottom there, is a red-headed quelea, a lovely bird that is on a lot of people's wish lists and quite regularly caught in Pietermaritzburg, where I used to run a ringing station for UKZN and BirdLife KZN Midlands. A little malachite kingfisher in the middle, and obviously a three-banded plover on the right. So how do we ring birds? Well, this is the process I'm going to take you through this evening. It's just to understand the hows and the whys of bird ringing as a whole. So obviously the first point is we need to capture the bird. We need to place a ring on the bird, and we need to take measurements of the bird and then release the bird back into the wild. And then we hope that someone recatches the bird or finds it when it dies, so we can get additional information about its movements and a whole bunch of other stuff. Just like this gorgeous bushshrike, which is one of the few birds that has no doubt in my mind where its name came from. So I'm going to go through this process. We'll start with capturing the bird, then placing the ring on, taking measurements, and I'll run you through it. And there's a variety of different techniques that we can use to capture birds. And the most commonly used technique that ringers use these days are nets called mist nets. And they really rocked up in probably the 1960s, 1970s, and became commercially available, and over time became the sort of premier way of catching small passerine birds. That's actually Professor Craig Symes as a postgraduate student, taking a bird out of a net in Vryheid. In our early days, we were kind of contemporaries. Craig started my ringing training, but we did honors together and did a lot of fun bird stuff together in the early years. And so mist nets are typically 12 meters long, about 2.5 meters high, and they're strung out on aluminium or bamboo poles. And they form this sort of capture technique where birds will fly in from either direction, fall into a pocket, and then lie there until a bird ringer comes and safely extracts them out the net. And to be honest, the hardest part of the process when I'm training someone is to get them adequately competent to be able to take birds out of the net on their own without damaging them. Obviously, the ethics of the bird and the welfare of the bird is paramount in this process. And the birds always come first if you're at a ringing station. Here's a different example. So those are yellow-billed kites in the sky at a pig farm in Albert Falls. And so ringers will try and catch birds even that are unusual and not normally caught. There's some white storks in the sky there as well, and some ravens and some cattle egrets. But at this particular farm, my highest count of yellow-billed kites in one day was 800 yellow-billed kites. And we used big, thick mesh duck nets to catch these birds as they came and swooped down to get the food that was put out for the pigs every day, which entailed the local farmer driving in his Isuzu long wheelbase bakkie that he had gone and collected all the offal and the chicken bits at local chicken abattoirs, and then would shovel off for the pigs to eat in the middle of the field. And yes, as bird ringers, that sounds exciting. So we would be out there with our nets trying to catch yellow-billed kites, which we were able to do quite successfully, fortunately. And there's Ben Hoffman from the African Bird of Prey Sanctuary in Pietermaritzburg, extracting a yellow-billed kite in our early days with Prof. Simons again. There's just a picture of barn swallows coming into roost. Even today, now that we know so much about the migratory patterns of swallows, there's still so much more to learn. And I'll give you some examples of that later. But when barn swallows come into roost at a reed bed, it provides a unique opportunity for ringers to get up close and personal and to get a large number trapped. And so there's a little picture of some nets up at a boardwalk here in Clintonburg Bay. And there's two birds that have been ringed in that photo, the barn swallow and my wife with her wedding ring on as well. Probably the most impressive bird I've ever ringed in my life. Then the process becomes, okay, taking the bird out the net. We've spoken about that, and that's the difficult part. But mist nets are not the only way that you can catch birds. There's a variety of other ways as well. So this is a trap called a flap trap or a spring trap, and then we have a southern fiscal and an African broadbill. And this is a ground-based trap that you bait with a mealworm, and it's kind of on a trigger mechanism. And as the bird grabs the worm, the trap flaps over the bird and is safely secured for the ringer to come and remove it. And I've trapped over 100 different species in this little ground-based trap, including seed eaters and frugivores and a whole range of birds that you wouldn't normally associate with eating insects. But especially during the breeding season, birds are after protein to feed their chicks, and you can catch a wide variety of species in these traps. You can even go old school and use the old string on a cage door and put some seed inside and put it closed. This is a photo from when I was still based at UKZN in Pietermaritzburg. I ran an animal research center there, and I put all the swept up seed from our research aviaries out in this old aviary for the doves and the thick-billed weavers. And when I had a spare hour or so, I would just pull the door closed and go in there and be able to ring a whole bunch of laughing doves and sparrows and thick-billed weavers and stuff like that. Or you can get sophisticated and get a friend. I had another ringer friend, Merrick Barker in Howick, make this for me. It's a collapsible trap, also with a little pull string mechanism, but also a little compartment that flops down so that you can contain the birds in the back third of the cage. You put your hand in from the top there in that little circular patch and be able to extract the birds once they've been caught. The weirdest bird I ever caught in this particular trap was a black sparrowhawk. I had set the trap to catch laughing doves, and I came and peered over the wall to now see if there were doves inside that I could pull the door closed. And instead I saw a black sparrowhawk peering at me from a closed trap. And he had actually flown in and hit a laughing dove, and just the sheer tenacity of flying in there and bumping the trap had accidentally triggered the trap. And I got a black sparrowhawk, which I now had to get out that little door without losing a finger. And it was quite fun, but it was definitely one for the books. Then a specialized form of ringing is raptor ringing. So not all ringers get a license to trap and ring raptors, but with some additional specialist training, you can use a trap like this. It's called a balchatri. It's been used by the Arab falconers for thousands of years to trap birds of prey. And it typically is a little cage covered with fishing line nooses, and it's weighted to the particular species you're trying to catch. And then it's got a live prey item inside. So it would either be a mouse, like in this case, on this long-crested eagle, or a small bird or something like that. Now, obviously, the welfare of the mouse is also important. And most of the time, the mice do not get physically harmed. They do get mildly psychologically traumatized, but unfortunately, there's not much we can do about that. We do have to cycle our mice through the process a bit, because they do learn to kind of sit in one corner and not move, and then nothing bad will happen to you. But if you're in that cage and you run around, some big scary bird will come down and run around on top of you. But it is a very effective way of catching birds of prey. We can also trap birds like African oyster catchers on their nest. So this is an oyster catcher nest where we've removed the actual oyster catcher eggs, and we're keeping them safely in the shade so that they don't overheat in the sun. Put 2 chicken eggs in its place. And this is a little plastic mesh with wire nooses or fishing line nooses on it. And again, the bird just walks on to sit back on its nest, and you trap it and you ring it, you put its eggs back, and it goes back onto the nest really quickly. Very effective. So another way of trapping beach nesting birds, in this case kelp gulls, and this involves a kind of walk-in kidney-shaped trap where there's only one entrance, and the gull or the oyster catcher or the white-fronted plover will walk in and sit back down on its nest. And then you can walk up towards the nest from the same direction as the entrance and remove the bird quite safely. And again, within minutes, they are back on their nest, and there's no harm caused. Of course, ringers do get quite ambitious and quite keen to see what is possible and what's not. So sometimes we'll even try and catch birds just with a butterfly net. And this is a friend of mine, Kevin Jolliffe, who at the time was a conservation manager on an island in the Seychelles, where I now run some research programs. And in the early days of me going and visiting them there, we decided we were going to try and catch things like bridal terns and sooty terns as they were sort of soaring above us with this extended pole. And we were able to successfully catch some. So there's a little bridal tern, probably the first one we caught like that quite a few years ago. But hand nets and little sort of ways of using hand nets to catch birds are also used for birds like this European nightjar, where you can dazzle them like some guides do on night drives, and you can sneak up and put a net over them and then ring them and measure them and release them again. And in this photo, you can see the amazing cavernous mouth of a nightjar and how they can just swallow so many insects in one mouthful as it's flying at night. You can also catch birds like swifts when they are coming out of their nests with the hand nets. Or you can even get cleverer and go and do research in areas where birds have no fear of humans and you don't even need a net. You can just catch them by hand. So birds like these fairy terns or white-tailed tropic birds or Audubon shearwaters, all species that I managed to trap on the nests with my hand without even needing any equipment whatsoever, because they live on tropical islands where birds have not evolved with mammalian predators, and so they're not scared of us, and we are able to work with them a lot easier. Then how ringing started was ringing nestlings, and that's still done a fair amount today. And so we've got a Corp's black tit from Windhoek on the top left there. We've got a dark-capped bulbul, a garden bird on the top right. Our bird of the year, the magnificent Cape parrot on the left. Some of the only wild Cape parrots to be ringed were nestlings, and I was privileged to be associated with that in the early days. And then bottom right-hand side, our magnificent blue swallows when they were still being ringed extensively to try and understand their movements. We were ringing them in KwaZulu-Natal Midlands as nestlings because it was so much easier than trying to catch the adults. And then the last way I just want to touch on how we can ring birds is that animal rehabilitation centers, which provide a really great opportunity for biologists and ringers to get some measurements, some biometric data, and be able to mark and release birds that we wouldn't normally necessarily catch in our nets or have access to as scientists. So, for example, on the left there, an immature palm nut vulture that came into Durban a number of years ago and was rehabilitated in Pietermaritzburg, and we then did a proper release program with it back up at Mtanzini, and it was seen for several years afterwards, even in adult plumage, thanks to those additional colorings that we put on. Crowned eagle, top right. The first few crowned eagles we ringed as a crowned eagle research group in Pietermaritzburg were rehabilitated birds. Obviously, subsequently, Shane McPherson did his master's and PhD with Prof. Colleen Downs and myself, and we now have over 100 crowned eagles in the greater Durban, Pietermaritzburg area, ringed, many of them with colorings, and mostly as wild nestlings and a few adult or immature caught birds as well. And then birds like this southern giant petrel, what a magnificent bird to get up close and personal with. That was a bird also in Durban, but I've done a few here in Plettenberg Bay as well. Just an unusual opportunity to get to grips with species that we wouldn't normally in our day-to-day research lives or birding lives even. Once the bird is captured, we would pop it in a bag and we would transport it to the ringing station for the day. So at the ringing station, you would have birds in bags. This is a very extreme example of a whole lot of barn swallows caught in a roost site, and they would sleep in the bag overnight once we've ringed them, because you don't want to let a bird go in the dark. That's not nocturnal. They sleep quite comfortably in the bags, and then we release them first light the next morning back at the reed bed, and they fly off and on the wiser. And in fact, in this picture, it represented one season of swallow ringing in Scottsville, Pietermaritzburg, where it was amazing. We had caught a foreign ringed bird from Finland. We had caught a foreign ringed bird from Sussex in England. And then 3 of the swallows that I had ringed that season were found in Latvia, Lithuania, and Kazakhstan the following year, which just showed the amazing versatility of these swallows and how they come from several European countries all the way down to one little reed bed in South Africa. Absolutely amazing. A ringing station typically just involves a place where the bird ringers and their team will sit and put the rings on the birds, take their measurements, and then release them back into the wild. This is a picture from Darwell Bird Sanctuary, which is a sewerage works. So birders typically love sewerage works, and so do bird ringers. So it's not unusual to get coffee and cake with the ripe smell of fresh sewerage while ringing a bird. And that being quite a normal part of the process for being trained as a bird ringer. Putting the ring on, if done correctly, no birds get hurt at all. And I often get asked the question, well, what happens when the bird grows a little bit bigger? Isn't that ring then going to be too tight, or isn't the ring too heavy? And for the most part, on small birds like this bus street chat, the rings are made of aluminium. They're very light, don't even weigh half a gram in some cases. And the interesting thing about passerine birds like this is when that bird takes the first flight. So, for example, for a Cape Robin chat at 3 weeks of age, takes his first flight from the nest, he never grows again. So that leg is as big as it's ever going to be for the rest of its life. And so we can safely put a ring on, knowing that we're not going to hamper or harm the bird in the years to come. Here's just a picture of an emerald spotted dove getting its ring put on. Specialist pliers that we import. Most of our ringing equipment is imported from Poland, and some of it from the UK and from elsewhere as well. We take a series of measurements. We can measure the wing and the bill and the tail, and we look at the condition of the molt, which is the process of growing new feathers. And as bird ringers, we look at the primary feathers predominantly for that, and I'll talk about that a little bit just now. We also look for the presence of a brood patch. Now, for those of you who understand a little bit about the function of feathers, feathers are really normally used to insulate and to keep body heat in. Of course, the feathers on the wings are for flight, and the colorful feathers are also for attraction, for sexual selection and stuff like that. But the feathers on the body are typically play an insulatory function. But we also know that if a female is incubating an egg, what she's really wanting to do is transfer her body heat from her body to the egg. And so feathers get in the way and prevent her from doing that. And so what some birders don't know is that birds will lose the belly feathers, not these outer ones that we can see here, but the next layer, the inner feathers, and they will grow a whole network of new capillaries in that area and shunt extra blood in there during the breeding season to form this hot, bare brood patch that looks something like that. And then they can transfer the heat to their eggs quite successfully. Remembering birds have a body temperature of 42 degrees Celsius, not 37.5 like you and I. So they really can form a hot patch of skin that can keep their eggs heated to 37, 38 degrees, which is what they want to be incubated at. That process of molt that I'm speaking about is really about growing new feathers. And in the wing of this yellow-billed kite, you can see a good example of that there, where the feathers closer to the edge of the tip, right at the edge of the feathers are quite old, and you can see they're worn and tatty. In the middle here, you can see two new feathers busy growing, and then you can see newer feathers on the inside of the primaries. So just a reminder that primary feathers are attached to the hand bone of the bird. Secondary feathers, which are these ones next to the primaries, are attached to the forearm of the bird. And the tertial feathers right at the back there are on the upper arm of the bird. And so as biologists, we can score the condition of the feathers on a scale of 0 being an old feather, 5 being a brand new feather, and 1 to 4 being various stages of growth in between. And over the 9 or 10 primary feathers, we can then get a score for that species of its molt at that particular point in time. You can then plot that for a species over time and look at how long it takes a bird to grow a new set of feathers and when they do that. Now, those of you with kids will understand when I say you don't want to molt and breed at the same time, because they're both energetically expensive processes. So the last thing you want to be doing is having to put energy into growing new feathers while you're trying to raise the kids. So birds generally separate molting and breeding out. And we'll look later at how some of these processes are being affected by climate change and global warming, and how bird ringing data is really leading the way of our understanding of how these processes are affecting bird biology. In this photo, this is a dusky indigo bird, and again, you can see the process of the older outer feathers slowly being dropped one at a time and being replaced by these new darker feathers. And it typically takes about 3 months for a bird to grow new feathers like this. While we have the birds in the hand, we can also look for abnormalities. So for example, he has a bronze mannequin and a female amethyst sunbird with unusual white feathers that wouldn't normally be there, but it enables us to have a look and see what can happen in plumages. We can also see disabilities like missing eyes, which is quite often found in birds like weavers and widow birds, like these two examples, where territorial males that often fight will often lose an eye because the aggression levels are high during the breeding season. It's kind of like after the rugby in the pub at about midnight and somebody steps on your girlfriend's toe. You end up having a little bit of a kerfuffle, and sometimes the ER room is needed afterwards. Other abnormalities and deformities will include things like missing toes or missing legs. In the case of this Cape Robin chat on the left here, it's almost certainly from a little entanglement issue. Animal hair, horse hair, cat hair, dog hair, human hair, cotton threads, things around the house that can entangle a foot, constrict it by the leg, and then it eventually rots and falls off. This weaver here, quite unusual, on the bottom right, has lost a whole leg. We find that now and then. And then this is a Cape wagtail on the top right. And most of you will recognize having seen things like this in wagtails. And unfortunately, wagtails have a propensity for a whole range of leg and feet related issues. There's a mite that eats the scales on their on their legs, which I suspect this is the case in this picture. They also suffer from entanglement issues like that robin did. And there's also fungus that can affect their legs as well. But yeah, one thing we find as bird ringers is you end up seeing a whole lot more deformities in wild birds than you would expect to. Here's some beak deformities as well. So there's a widow bird, a fan-tailed widow bird at the top, a collared sunbird bottom left, and a black-crowned chagra on the right, each with various different bill deformities or injuries that the birds are having to cope with, and seemingly doing quite fine. I've even caught an olive sunbird the once in a forest down in southern KwaZulu-Natal with the entire top mandible missing. And the sunbird was still obviously in good body condition. It was in perfect nick, still able to feed and forage and drink nectar even with half its beak missing, which was quite unusual. We do then get unusual growth deformities as well, and something like this could probably be blocked feather follicles or something like that that has caused these growth protuberances, which are obviously very painful for the bird. But we make notes of those, and we're able to then see if we subsequently recapture those birds, if there's any change or improvement in the bird's health. One of the last things we do is weigh the bird, and this is a picture of a fairy tern or a white tern from the Seychelles sitting on a digital scale, and it's the easiest and quickest way to get a quick measurement of the body weight of the bird, which is quite important in some of the work that we do. We then use the last opportunity to quickly photograph a bird. That's Dr. Lindy Thompson on the left from Endangered Wildlife Trust's vulture program, and Karen Nelson, a fantastic citizen scientist and bird ringer in BirdLife KZN Midlands, photographing a Birchall's cuckoo just before release at Darwin Bird Sanctuary. And obviously the opportunity to see birds like this close up, like this Narina trogon, is really special. And so we take photos not just to share in beautiful talks like this and on social media, but in some cases also to document particular plumages, especially in raptors and waders, and then link those photos as we recapture the bird as it gets older and older, which enables us to learn a lot more about plumage transitions and things like that. The last thing we do is release the bird, and there's a very old photo of my wife many years ago releasing a immature jackal buzzard in the Karkloof in KwaZulu-Natal. And there's a picture of Shane McPherson releasing one of our, in fact, the first crowned eagle that we had trapped and ringed for his long-term project on crowned eagles. So that's the how. Let's now get to the why. So why do we ring birds? And typically the sort of old school way that ringing was done, why ringing was done, was to learn things like the longevity of birds. How long do birds live? How far do they move? How far do they not move? Are some birds totally stable in a position, in a place, and they don't move at all? What are the morphometric differences between males and females? And can we, in sexually monomorphic species, be able to tell males and females apart using some of those measurements? Get that molt data that we're talking about, and even looking at presence and absence data for cryptic forest birds. Sometimes you'll pick up birds in a net that you haven't even picked up with normal bird census techniques. Is a Hottentot teal or blue-billed teal on the left, malachite kingfisher again, and a beautiful orange-breasted waxbill. So longevity, if I had to ask the audience how old they thought birds could live for, and I'll use this Cape Robert chat as an example. Normally when I ask this question to groups of people in the field while we're ringing, most people take a guess of between 6 and 8 years. Some are like actually at the low end and they'll say, well, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Some people will guess of maybe 10 or 12 years. But you know, the Jeff Ockwood's record for a Cape Robin chat is 18 years and 3 months. And the record for a chorister robin chat is 24 years. So these robin chats actually live a lot longer than what we give them credit for. And then in the southern hemisphere, we found through bird ringing studies that our birds live a lot longer than their northern hemisphere counterparts. And that's because of different life history strategies that they take. So we have a very unpredictable climate in the southern hemisphere. The northern hemisphere traditionally has had a very predictable climate. So I typically joke and say Scotland has a very predictable summer. It's normally on a Wednesday, and then that's it. But obviously it's a little bit longer than that. But they have a predictable, highly productive breeding season where birds will lay large clutch sizes. Some passerines in the northern hemisphere will have 6 to 8 eggs in a clutch, but they'll live a shorter life period, whereas our southern hemisphere birds with unpredictable environments have smaller clutch sizes. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. You'll have multiple breeding attempts in a year, which is quite rare in the northern hemisphere. But you'll live for a lot longer. And overall, this balances out and you have similar reproductive output over the course of a bird's lifetime. It's just a different strategy and different adaptation. So here's a couple of examples. There's a spectacled weaver. The record for a spectacled weaver is 12 years, 4 months. The next one is a yellow-fronted canary. Record is 10 years, 4 months, which is quite a long period of time for a canary. And then if we take the extreme example, not a South African example, but there is a Latian albatross called Wisdom. She's the world's oldest known wild bird. She is a breeding bird on Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge, and she is somewhere between the age of 71 and 72 years old. And she still raised a chick a year or two ago, and they're waiting to see now if she's going to lay an egg this year. So ladies, there's no excuse. You can still keep going and reproduce at the ripe old age of 71, 72, if you're a Latian albatross. Of course, the oldest bird in captivity was a male sulfur-crested cockatoo that lived to 120 years old. So we know birds from bird ringing studies and captivity-based studies can live a lot longer than what we maybe sometimes give them credit for. If we look at movements, now remember we've spoken about migration and northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, trans-equatorial, but localized movements are just as important to understand, especially from a conservation point of view. And there's a simple example of a brown-throated martin that was ringed in Pietermaritzburg and then retrapped up the north coast in Zululand a few years later. And the annual examples we get are birds that are ringed on the west coast, and they follow the sardine run down the bottom of the coastline and then come into rehab. For example, this immature Cape Gannet, last year's bird of the year in Durban. Obviously, the red line doesn't represent the distance or the path that the bird took. The bird would have gone all the way along the coastline, but that red line represents the minimum distance that the bird would have flown if it flew in a straight line direction. And then, of course, like we said, we've got these examples, and that's just some of those birds from that one summer that I had caught in one reed bed in Pietermaritzburg. Here's another example, a local one from here in Plet. This was a parasitic jager or skewer that was found exhausted at sea in Plet in December 2012. We released it back out at sea after rehabilitation a month later, but it had already been ringed, and it was 17.5 years after ringing that we had found it, which would have equated to about 375,000 kilometers just on a straight direction there and back once a year. And obviously that's a lot of Voyager miles, frequent flyer miles, and it probably is closer to 2 to 3 times that distance, rather taking the actual route of the bird rather than just what the bird did on a straight line. And one more example, this was a Corey shearwater that a friend of mine, Chanel, found on a beach here in Plettenberg Bay. It had been ringed in Portugal in October 1979. It was 40 years old. It's the oldest known Corey shearwater that we know of to date. So now I put up a photo like this, and I want to talk about things like morphometrics. And we say, okay, what is that species? And so if you're a ringer, you will hopefully recognize it as an Acrocephalus warbler. But then you'll sort of get nervous because you'll say, well, Mark, I need to see the wing open. I want to see if it's got a pointy wing or a rounded wing. I need to see the color of the soles of the feet, and I need to see some measurements before I can tell you exactly what the species is. And this is the tricky thing. Sometimes we look at these birds as birders in the field, and if they're calling, it's great, we can identify them, but not all migrating birds call when they're here in Africa. So this, for example, is what we used to call a European marsh warbler. Now it's called a marsh warbler, and I think it's recently been lumped back with what we were calling an African reed warbler. Or is it the reed warbler that's now lumped with the African reed warbler? I can't keep up with the taxonomists, and I'm not really a twitcher, and I don't catch these in the Western Cape anymore, so I forget which is which. But literally, there's a little set of measurements that we would take catching these birds, and we'd work out a ratio of measurements to what is called a Wallander score, and that would enable us to successfully identify which species of Acrocephalus warbler we are dealing with in the hand. Here's some example of molt. So we've got in the main picture there, a 1-year-old fan-tailed widow bird. It's the only time that you can accurately tell exactly how old a fan-tailed widow bird is, because immature birds and female adults all have brown primaries. Adult males have black primaries. So it's only when a bird is a year old and molting into its first male breeding plumage that you can accurately age these males as 1-year-old, because you can see the difference between their juvenile plumage in brown and their adult plumage in black. There's a Deirdre cuckoo top right and a scraggy red bishop molting into breeding plumage on the top left-hand side. And so one of the things we're looking at is this variation in time it takes at when birds initiate molt. And that's very much depends on molting, on weather patterns. So in these bronze manakins in Pietermaritzburg, you can see adult bronze manakins would normally start molting by about day 30 of the year, so roughly the end of January, and they would molt through to about day 200 on average, if you just drew a regression line through there. That was in 1992. But with the weather conditions changing, in 1996, they started molting a lot later, around about day 75, which is like the middle of March, and then would molt up to about day 260, 270, somewhere around there. So the type of data we're gathering as bird ringers enables us to then look at climate patterns, birds' responses, and how that changes over time at particular locations and for particular populations. And then I spoke about presence-absence data. So here's just a couple of photos and a list of birds that the first time they were ever recorded at Darwell Bird Sanctuary was when they were caught in mist nets. So we've got a black-bellied starling there, we've got a common white throat, we've got a wattle-eyed flycatcher, we also had short-tailed pipit, azure reed warbler, yellow-crowned bishop, pearl-breasted swallow, bunch of species that never been seen by birders before, but occasionally creep through as vagrants, and you catch them maybe in mist nets when birders might not even notice them. So the importance of ringing. And then more recently, what we're finding is we're able to document range expansions of birds as well. So the SABAP data is really good at enabling us to do that, but so is bird ringing. So for example, here's a white-browed scrub robin, a very common bird in its habitat, but never been recorded in the Western Cape until we started catching them down in Nature's Valley. And I saw someone logged in from Nature's Valley this evening. So this was some of the work I was doing when I was still part of an NPO down there. And then subsequently, we've documented the species at other ringing locations in the Western Cape as well. And with brood patches, so we know they're breeding in the province as well. You also start realizing that fynbos birds or fynbos habitat sometimes gets very scrubby, very dense, and you start picking up how forest birds will start using densely packed fynbos as corridors to move between forest patches as well. And bird ringing enables us to do that. So here's some quick examples. There's a white-starred robin, a scaly-throated honeyguide, and olive bushshrike, yellow-throated woodland warbler, my tambourine dove. And then just want to point out, apart from all of this research reasons for why we want to still ring birds, I want to point out that it's also really educational and really fun. So one of the things I've tried to do throughout my career is include people in bird ringing outings, school groups, university groups, bird clubs, members of the public, to get them passionate about birds, especially young kids. It's so easy to do when you've got them sort of awestruck by these magnificent feathered friends of ours up close and personal. As long as the welfare of the bird comes first, you can do a lot in terms of education through bird ringing programs. For example, there's a bunch of kids helping me release an African harrier hawk at the top of the pass in Nature's Valley. It was a rehabilitated bird. We auctioned off the opportunity of people at one of our bird ringing outings to help me release that bird, and we raised funds for the rehabilitation center that had put that bird back into the wild. Right, so that's mostly the end of the presentation. I just wanted to end off with a few extra slides just to say that there are a couple of extra reasons why we now want to still ring birds. So I sometimes get told, you know, ringing is an outdated research tool. It's no longer needed. We can put satellite transmitters on. We can use radar to track birds when they fly in big flocks. There's all these new technologies that we can use. But I'll tell you what, there's a couple of other valid uses for bird ringing as a tool, apart from what we already use. Remember, for your average South African ornithologist, satellite tagging is not a viable research method. Each satellite tag will cost in the order of about 20,000 Rand. So now you want to track 5 birds to get a reasonable sample size. That's already 100,000 Rand. Plus you will pay, on average, about 1,000 Rand a month just to get the data from the Argos satellite systems. So 2-year study, you whack another 24,000 Rand on that just to get your data, and you pay for as long as that system is live. So if your battery carries on and you're still wanting data, well, you're going to keep coughing up your money. 25,000 Rand, I can literally ring thousands of birds, and I can ring birds a lot smaller than satellite tags can currently fit. So all the reasons we've already spoken about, still very valid, but 2 new reasons. Avian influenza, when it started in the early 2000s, it was bird ringers going around and collecting swab samples from wild birds to test for avian flu. And it's still something that happens when there's outbreaks around the world. And then climate change. Climate change and predicted global warming suggests that in a particular place, at a particular location, an increase in temperature, if you apply Bergman's rule, which is a biological rule, you can go and Google it and see what it says, you should get a reduced body mass in birds over time. Or if you look at Allen's rule, you should get an increased wing length over time. And published research already shows this for a few Israeli and Australian species and a few UK species in a shorter space as the last 30 years. Reductions in body mass, increases in wing length. So here's an Israeli example, yellow-vented bulbul, just between 1955 and 1995. There's a significant reduction in body mass as the temperature at that site has gone higher. A local example from Pietermaritzburg, from the Darwell dataset, probably South Africa's longest running research ringing station. It's been going for about 45 years, or getting close to 45 years, just from 1985 to 2010 when I left, a reasonably significant reduction in average body size. And Dr. Alan Lee, who I think might be on tonight, and myself we've been talking for years about properly analyzing this data and publishing it as well to show that our Southern African birds do the same thing. There's another example for village weavers. And so in summary, this is my family. A year ago in the Karoo, we were there a month ago again, and also catching birds. My wife is also a trained bird ringer and biologist, and my kids are in training too. My son has started doing research with me now. So very much it's my research tool, but it's my family hobby as well. Ringing still has a huge role to play. when done ethically, responsibly, with proper training, it is a fantastic research tool. We need more long-term sites. We need more ringers, more citizen scientists. You know, I said we've got close to about 200 ringers in Southern Africa. Most of those are citizen scientists, not professional ornithologists. There's probably only a dozen, at most 24 professional ornithologists that are bird ringers. The rest are people like you guys that take this up as a hobby and get to contribute towards science and our understanding of birds. It's an essential tool, I believe, and more importantly, it's fun. And that's me. Christina, I hope that wasn't too long, and I'm sure we'll have some questions after that.
No, that wasn't too long at all. Thank you very much. That was fascinating, and it's always amazes me how much you can learn from ringing, as you've so eloquently showed us. And I think it also gives you a kind of a greater appreciation for the birds that you wouldn't normally get if you just kind of see them while birding. So thank you very much for sharing those insights with us. Before we get on to some questions, I just want to remind everyone we'll be back again in 2 weeks' time on the 22nd of August, this time looking at bird calls and why birds sing and why we should listen. We've got two people from the Macaulay Library, the United States, Mike Webster and Cullen Hanks, and I'm sure it's going to be an equally fascinating talk. So please do join us in 2 weeks' time. Okay, so there are quite a few questions coming in. So please, if anyone else has any questions, please pop them in the Q&A box. So firstly, from Vincente, saying, thanks for a very interesting talk. Have you detected any harmful effects of bird ringing?
So that's a really good question, and something I forgot to cover in the talk. So, you know, obviously I get asked this question, isn't it stressful for the birds? And the short answer is yes, it is. But fortunately, there is some really good research published, I think it was from the UK, that measured stress hormone levels released in birds under various normal parameters that a bird would encounter. And what they've kind of discovered and documented is that being caught in a net, put in a bag, ringed, and then released is about the same stress intensity and level as being chased by a goshawk and escaping unharmed. So I kind of relate it to this. I say it's like you snoozing on the couch after mom's magnificent Sunday lunch. And as you're drifting off, the wind blows the door closed and you get a really big scrick. And your heart starts pumping and you've got that adrenaline rush, but an hour or two later, you don't even remember it. So it's a short-term stress with no long-term effect, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. And it also just kind of highlights again the importance of being trained correctly, and as you emphasized a couple of times in your talk, having the welfare of the bird being paramount throughout the whole process.
Yeah.
So Shashi asks a related question about the risks of ringing to the bird, but also the birder. So you've covered the risks of ringing to the bird, but are there any risks to the birder?
There is. So look, like I say, the odd bird can get injured, and so I set myself a pretty tough standard. If I start seeing an injury in a bird, more than one every 1,000 birds that I ring, like, you know, an accidental nick on the leg or a little bit of blood coming out of the side of a mouth or something like that, I start questioning my standards and I start saying, okay, well, what do I need to do better? So that's important, that we always try to minimize that impact as much as possible. In any research technique where we are going to physically do something to an animal, there is the risk of harm to the birds, but we try and minimize it as much as possible, which is why the training is so important. And then in terms of the risk to the ringers, yes, some birds can damage birders and ringers quite badly. So I said Craig Symes that trained me, and he trained me on those thick-billed weavers, and they bite like little blixens, and they're like little vice grips. Obviously, when we work with raptors, you really got to worry about the talons, not so much the beaks. But I've seen ringers get seriously injured from talons before. And then some birds like those pied barbets that my family were holding, they can also really bite really sore. But again, with the right training, the right technique, you minimize that, and you make sure that that doesn't happen too often.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was a question in the chat which someone helpfully answered, but perhaps you can expand on that, about where people report, if they find a dead bird or they observe a ring on a live bird, where do they report that information? And Etienne also asked in the Q&A box how those data are made available to the general public, if they are.
Yeah, so very quick questions. And Peter Hamming, who is a ringer in the Lowveld, he answered in the chat with a nice little web link there for anyone who wants to go and get it. So there's on the SAFRing website, there is a click now button where you can report a ringed bird. The SAFRing Facebook page, I sit on the steering committee of SAFRing, and we also use that to try and get members of the public to report birds there. If they're not going to go and click on a website, sometimes they'll just post something on the Facebook page. And there's a few of us that keep an eye on that and try and get information back to people. In terms of the overall data availability, anyone who's wanting to see the data can actually contact SAFRing via that website and get sent data that can be used to look at the data. A few ringers do put restrictions on their own particular data, generally ornithologists that are doing particular work on particular species. So before they publish their stuff, they put a restriction on the data accessibility. But in general, a lot of the data is available. And for example, Derek Engelbrecht is on the chat this evening. He is the overall editor of Roberts 8. And he'll tell you one of the most valuable data sets we have to look at, apart from SAT2, is the bird ringing database, because we can look at a lot there to incorporate into field guides and resources like Roberts, the longevity of birds, the distances they fly, the recapture rates, local movements, all of that all comes from that bird ringing data.
Yeah, absolutely. And that reminds me that I have a ring that I need to report. I unfortunately found a dead swifting or greater crested tooth, so I need to add that to the database. So there were a couple of questions, one from Robin and one from Rochelle, about finding ringing groups, getting involved in ringing. So Robin was asking about Cape Town, and Rochelle is in Botswana, asking to get some training in ringing, and how to become a ringer and play a part in this important research.
Yeah. So Botswana is a little bit more difficult, Rochelle, because there's less bird ringers there, but there are some ringing groups that operate, and sometimes there's South African ringers that go through to Botswana and work. So I would recommend getting in touch with BirdLife Botswana. They probably have a list of the current ringers that are operating in Botswana, depending on where you are in the country as well. But if you in Gaborone or close to there, I know there's some ringing groups there, and BirdLife Botswana, if you Google them and look for an email address, I'm sure they'll be able to help you. And then Robin, in terms of Cape Town, there's actually a couple of really good ringing sites and ringing groups there. So Dito Shadles, who's on the session tonight, he's probably the most experienced ringer in Cape Town, if not one of the most in the country. And he runs bird ringing courses in the Western Cape, mostly around Cape Town. They've got one coming up shortly. So I'll do a little punt for the BDI. You can just Google BDI ringing and you'll find, or look on Facebook and you'll find the courses that Dieter runs. And that's if you want to get involved there. But there's also there's guys that ring at Rondeflay. There's guys that ring at various sites around Cape Town. And again, just pop an email to SAFRing and they'll be able to put you in touch with particular ringers in your area.
Thanks. And I see Dieter has put his email address in the chat box. So if you want to get hold of Dieter for ringing in Cape Town, just check the chat box.
Great.
So there's two more questions, which we'll try and get through. So firstly, from Mark Winslow in the UK, saying there are very strict rules around the use of lures, especially when ringing. In South Africa, there appears to be a different approach to using your lures, even when bird watching. Who is the body that controls this process?
Yeah, so it's a good question, Mark. By lures, I'm assuming you're talking about like the live bait, like in the bell chattery and stuff like that. And yes, that is illegal in the UK. It is still legal in South Africa. And that is predominant. Look, SAFRing is the organization, so it's the South African Ringing Unit based at the University of Cape Town through the Percy Fitzpatrick Institute for Ornithology. But and I sit on that steering committee. We've got representatives from BirdLife South Africa that sit on that committee as well. And we oversee that sort of the ethics of bird ringing in the country. And at this point in time, because our animal rights organizations have not taken a stance of making an issue of that, we still allow suitably qualified raptor ringers to use live bait as traps. It's not every ringer that is able to do that. You have to do specialist training. And so it is something that is still available across most of Africa. Those lures can still be used.
Thanks for that. Then there's a question from Eddie asking, why do birds lose weight as climate or as temperatures increase? So referring to your last question.
Okay, let me try and give a 30-second answer to a very complex question. So essentially, remember I said that birds have a body temperature of 42 degrees Celsius during the day. At night, they will drop their body temperature down. They're not completely homeothermic like we are as humans. And body temperature regulation is a very dynamic process, and it is affected by body size. So your typical birds are nice and small, which means they've got a very large surface area to volume ratio. And effectively, what that means is that they lose heat to the environment rather quickly than if you're big. And so a reduction in body size as a selective advantage to a warming climate is something that has been postulated. Essentially, it comes from Bergmann's rule. And Bergmann's rule says that the further you get away from the equator in a particular species, your body size gets bigger because you want to lose heat at a slower rate to the environment in cooler or colder conditions. But what we've done as biologists is turn that rule on its head, and instead of looking at distance from the equator, we're looking at distance over time. And as it gets warmer in a particular location, there are some species that are showing a reduction in body size because they then lose heat slower to them, or they lose heat faster to the environment when it's hotter. So it's a coping mechanism for dealing with high temperatures.
Thanks. That was a good answer to a complex question. Thank you. So there's just one more question that's come into the Q&A box from Peter Archdale, asking whether there's any interaction between South African bird ringing and tagging programs such as vulture tagging.
Yeah, very good question. So essentially, vultures are ringed and tagged. And so the person responsible for tagging that vulture is responsible for submitting that data along with the tag and the ring information to SAFRing. So all that data sits on the SAFRing database. Is it an exact science that's always done perfectly? No, sadly not. It's the same, the color rings that I put, like you saw there on the oyster catchers and the gulls and things like that. that gets submitted with my saffron data. But sometimes I come across a coloring bird or a patagial tag bird, and the data isn't in the saffron database. Fortunately, we generally, as a group of ornithologists in South Africa, know who's working on what. And so if it's not in the saffron database, we're generally able to track it and trace it, because we're able to look and see who is working on those birds. In the case of the vulture tagging, there is a move to look at moving away from the patagial tagging. There's a little bit of growing evidence to suggest that it might have marginal negative impacts on birds. Not that it's killing birds or it's doing harm to birds or anything like that, but as was the case when we stopped flipper tagging penguins, the decision was made there based on a marginal influence on their swimming aerodynamics. And so a similar scenario is being discussed at the moment at relatively high levels with vulture researchers and raptor researchers around the country. Should we carry on with that patagial tagging or not, or should we maybe move back to these engraved colorings that have become pretty effective in some other studies?
Great, yeah, thanks for that. I had heard that about the vulture patagial tags, so that's very interesting. And yeah, as you said, interesting parallels to penguin ringing or banding as well. So Peter, follow up, if you don't mind, quickly. Peter said he has a photo of a tagged white-backed vulture. Should he also send the tag info to the ringing database? I would hazard a guess to say yes.
Yeah, I would say, Peter, just pop onto the Saffron site, either click on that report a bird or go onto the Saffron Facebook page, which is even better. You can pop your photo up there and just see if you can get an answer from them.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. I think we've exhausted all the questions now. I see
one more question there in the webinar chat that I wouldn't mind answering if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. I must have missed it. Not being.
No, it's okay. Mark Jarvis asked, he said, very interesting talk, thank you. You mentioned that ringing is still an important data gathering exercise. For those who think this method to be redundant, what are the alternatives? And I mean, the simple question to that is, it depends on what data you're trying to get. If you're talking about large birds and you're looking at movement data that you need, I would say the alternative would be satellite tracking, geolocation tags, a bunch of other things that probably actually place slightly more stress on the birds than pure ringing. If you're looking at some of the other reasons why we collect bird ringing data and what we use it for from a scientific point of view, the sad reality is there is no alternative.
Yeah, absolutely. I can speak from the penguin side of things, is, we stopped flipper banding and there was a big gap in the data that we were able to get on important parameters like survival, age at first breeding, and all those sorts of information that we weren't able to get because we were no longer flipper banding. The gap has now been filled with microchips, but we still can't get all the information that we could because the microchips are implanted in the birds and can't be read by someone just observing them. So yeah, I think ringing still, even if people call it outdated, it still provides information that you cannot get in any other way. So Andrew Marshall, I see you've just put a question in the chat that I've partially answered. So penguins now have little microchips similar to what you would put in your pets, and then we have these readers, RFID readers, in a lot of the colonies that pick up whether the penguin has a microchip or not.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think now we have exhausted all the questions. So thank you very much for answering all of those and for your very, very interesting talk. There are lots of positive messages coming in through the chat box. So thank you very much to all our listeners tonight. And thank you for tuning in to Conservation Conversations. And thank you very much, Mark, for a fascinating presentation.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me, Christina.
Great. And with that, I think we'll close off. I'll leave the Zoom room open just in case anyone wants to put a last message in the chat. But thank you very much again. And we'll see you in 2 weeks' time for another Conservation Conversations. Good night.